This is Nerds with Words, unlocking the vault of knowledge one nerdy fact at a time. I'm your host, Wonder Nerd, and today we're talking about toppings of lies, core issues, and weed. But not the kind you're thinking of. First, where did pizza come from? This is the part of the podcast where I get mad about how hard it is to get an answer out of anyone without developing trust issues. Next, what we think is at the center of our planet and why we think it looks like that. How to make plastic less plasticky with weed. Seaweed, that is. Side note, you can also use weed or even corn, but today we're just talking about seaweed. Then we'll move on to puns and finish off with a new segment called Catastrophe Bloopers, where my cat interrupts me while recording and makes my life more difficult than it already is. Let's get started, nerds. Have you ever wanted to be confused about pizza history? Well, now you will. According to the internet, which has done nothing but test my patience, Egyptians helped invent pizza by discovering yeast. To me, that's like saying I'm a rocket scientist because I totally launched a bottle rocket one time. Now we look at the real inventor of pizza. The Romans. Just kidding, it was the Greeks in 1600 BC. Just kidding, it was in Naples, Italy in 997 AD. Just kidding, it was 1000 AD. But the real Neapolitan pizza wasn't invented until 1535. Just kidding, basil wasn't discovered until the 1600s, and tomatoes didn't get there until the 1600s as well. Just kidding, it was 1760. So the real Neapolitan pizza wasn't invented until the 1700s. Just kidding, it was the early 1800s, because mozzarella wasn't invented until the 1800s. So the true, real Neapolitan pizza wasn't invented until 1858. But the pizza we knew wasn't invented until 1889 when some random queen's blessing was bestowed upon a very specific type of pizza. Just kidding, the pizza we know in America wasn't invented until the end of the 1800s with tomato and mozzarella pizza. The first pizzerias documented in America was only as early as 1905 before it became popularized all over the world in the 1960s. Moral of the story, everyone invented pizza, but not really, and it was a specific time, but not that time. Moving on. Just like my therapist said when we first met, we need to get to the core of the issue, and in this case, we're talking about the core of the Earth. The Earth is kind of like an onion made of lots of layers. If you get that reference, you get an imaginary gold star. Good for you, nerd. There are two sections of the core, the outer core and the inner core. The outer core stretches from a depth of 2,900 to 5,150 kilometers and is made up of liquid iron and nickel. The amazing thing is this motion generates a magnetic field called the magnetosphere. Kind of sounds like a supervillain to me, but this magnetic field is what protects us from radiation. Imagine, if you will, going out into the sun for a few hours without sunscreen and getting a serious burn. Without the magnetic field, you would be turned to soup in seconds. That takes suspicious stew to a whole new level. Moving on to the inner core, stretching from a depth of 5,150 to 6,371 kilometers, you'd also imagine this would be a liquid, but instead, due to the pressure, it's actually a solid. It's only theorized for it to be a solid sphere of iron with minor amounts of nickel and other light elements, but it's not completely known since this is an active field of research. If you want a good idea about this concept, or just have a couple hours to burn on one of the greatest movies of all time, you can watch the 2003 movie The Core. It's an amazing movie, 10 out of 10 from me. Moving on, nerds. 6% of the global oil consumption is believed to be from plastic alone, and it is expected to get up to 20% by 2050. We do have a few options. First option is probably the best option. Completely stop producing and using plastic and research ways to break down the current mountains of plastic and microplastics that plague our environment. That's probably not going to happen because it's about as cheap as I am to produce petroleum plastic, and it's also easy, so let's talk about another option. There are certain plants that can be turned into plastic by first breaking it down into sugar, allowing microbes to ferment the sugar, which then turns it into a powder that can be turned into plastic. Just like with anything, there are pros and cons to seaweed plastic. Starting with the pros, seaweed plastic is soluble in water, but the amount of time depends on the thickness and the conditions of the water. For example, if you put plastic wrapping into the water, it could take about a few hours for it to break down, but compare that to hundreds of years of petroleum plastic, that's much more agreeable. On the contrary, if plastic wrapping is added to boiling water, it could take as little as a few minutes before it dissolves into the water and is typically safe for human consumption. So if you ever want to eat plastic, this might be in our future. In addition, seaweed is abundant, and even some harmful algae blooms can be harvested and made into plastic. Bags to clothes to straws can all be made from seaweed plastic. Moving on to the cons, the process of building seaweed plastic is currently more expensive than petroleum plastic, but with more research and time, that could change. In terms of cost, it's more cost effective to use seaweed farms that float on the surface of the water where it can grow to be harvested. This has a few issues. First, the seaweed farms could block sunlight for the plant matter below, and if disease were to break out amongst a seaweed farm, then it would all fall. Having small floating farms spread over a large area is both safer for both the environment and the farms, but can also be more expensive. Plastic was once a groundbreaking invention for how durable it is. But that same durability, along with the epidemic of single use plastics, have led to overfilling landfills and oceans full of plastic that will take hundreds, if not thousands, of years for everything to break down. This is not viable, and in another segment, I will talk about how microplastics are destroying entire ecosystems. Something needs to change, and it needs to change now. That's all for this segment, nerds. Now we move on to my favorite part of the podcast where I cause the following symptoms: laughter, groans, and the prayer I die alone, which will probably happen anyway. Time for puns. Our first pun is a pickup line, and there's 4 puns in one pickup line. You're so welcome. You're gonna get everybody. You ready? Sorry if this sounds cheesy, but you've melted my heart. I'm taking you out for pizza. It's the yeast I can do. um, did you know that Earth is the third planet from the sun? So technically, we're all third world countries, which is kind of true. Why can you always count on seaweed when you're in trouble? Because they're always willing to help out. Alrighty, nerds, before you go back to the mundane, immerse yourself in the extraordinary by trying to learn at least one random useless fact a day. You can tell them to your reflection, a tree, or your cat. How fun is that? Ooh, that rhymed. Links to the articles for this podcast are in the bio. This was Nerds with Words, where I spend my time talking about things that make me happy because I'm bored and have nothing better to do. Stay curious, stay nerdy. Bye, nerds. No, I do not need your help. I don't need your help. Thank you very much, but you cannot help me with my podcast. No, no helping. Okay. I'll put you in the bloopers. How about that?